So in this video, what we're doing here is we're starting to outline then how individual consumers make decisions. And in the next chapter, we're going to look at how firms make decisions. So if you've looked a little bit deeper, you've into like this course itself and how it's cross-listed, or not cross-listed, but that you can use this course both to fulfill intermediate microeconomics requirements as well as, well, this is an elective course, managerial economics. These next two chapters are essentially what you would get in a intermediate microeconomics course. So the point of this chapter is essentially, how do consumers make decisions? And what we know thus far is we, in some sense, know what the objective is. And that objective is to maximize utility, or to be as happy as they possibly can be. But and I guess we should say this, and the way that we know how they maximize utility, at least from the principles class, is that they do things until the marginal benefit of doing that activity equals the marginal cost of doing that activity. That right? At that point, that would be where they maximize utility. Well, we want to go deeper into that and look a little bit more closely at how consumers make their decisions. That's the whole point of this chapter. So this is the knowledge that you would have thus far based on your principles classes, and that's what we're going to build from. Okay. And again, when I skip slides, it's just because it's introductory material that I just feel that we can largely skip here. Okay, so the issue then is, how do we understand the demand curve itself? And that demand curve itself reflects there being a willingness and there being an ability to do something, right? And we looked at that in the previous chapter. That would mean we need some function that can describe, I'm sorry, not this part, sorry about that. We need some function that can ascribe my ability to buy the product, and then I have some function that's going to describe my preferences or my willingness to buy that product. Demand has to fulfill, again, both conditions. So we need to understand these two functions. And there are going to be points at which I have both a willingness and ability to buy the product. That's going to describe my demand. So building from that, we need to talk about preferences themselves. And so the preferences, again, we're talking about why I want certain things and why I want some things more than others. And what we're going to do this is we're going to have to talk about the properties of preferences. So these are basically the assumptions that we're making. And the assumptions that we're making are primarily four assumptions. Let's talk about each of these. The first one is that bundles of goods. I don't know why it decided not to write this in. I'll write this in. Maybe this is just a test of my understanding of the material. So when we say bundles of goods, we're just saying kind of like, what if a person were just buying two products? Let's say lamps and pens. I'm just making up things. Okay, so let's say I have a set of lamps and pens. That I could have a certain bundle of goods. And so here's the idea. If I have one bundle that has 3 lamps and 6 pens, let's call this bundle number 1. And I have bundle number 2 that has 5 lamps and let's say 4 pens. Okay, so we have two bundles here. And so then I could say, what I have to be able to say, at least in this first property of preferences, is that one of these three relationships exists between these two bundles. I either prefer 1 to 2, I do not prefer 1 to 2, or I am indifferent. Basically, I don't really care which one I get. So we're saying again, for the first property of preferences is that every preference can be compared to each other with one of these three relationships. Either I really want it, I don't want it, or I don't care. The second property is that more is always better. Now you'll notice here I picked these numbers a little bit mysteriously. I had more of one and less of the other, so that there was no clear-cut way of saying that bundle 1 had to be preferred to bundle 2. All that property number 2 here is saying is that if I had a bundle that had 3 lamps and 6 pens, and another bundle that had 5 lamps and 10 pens, what this assumption is saying, all that this assumption is saying is that bundle 2 would be preferred to bundle 1 because bundle 2 has more of both goods. More is always better. Assumption number 3 that we're going to make is that as people buy more of the product, they are going to have diminishing willingness to buy that good. That preferences basically reflect the fact that eventually I get exhausted from consuming something, and so as I consume more of it, I get less and less happiness out of it. And then the fourth assumption is transitivity, which is basically saying that these are logically consistent preferences. In other words, if I have bundle A and bundle A is preferred to bundle B, and let's say that bundle B is preferred to bundle C, then from transitivity, where we say 3 dots, therefore A would be preferred to C. Right? Because if A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, then it must necessarily be the case that A is preferred to C. These are the 4 properties of preferences that we're going to use here to describe why I buy what I buy. Now, what I want is constrained. The constraint that I face is that I have to pay certain prices for products, and I have only a limited amount of income to allocate to those things. So I need to then look at what is constraining what I want. That constraint is called our budget constraint. What that budget constraint basically says is that I have an income level, and we are kind of assuming here that I'm spending all of my money, and that basically my income is going to be allocated towards 2 products, goods Y and Z, let's say, each of them having a price multiplied by the quantity for each of the items, that basically my total spending would equal my income here. And then I then have a budget constraint that looks like this, where I guess I could change this to good Z, I don't know. That basically then the slope here is going to reflect the prices, and this is going to reflect my maximum ability to afford these 2 goods. It's a straight line because the prices do not change. Bundles within that line are certainly affordable. Points outside the line are unaffordable. This is my constraint. This is the thing that limits what I can buy that I want. I don't know if I really like this market rate of substitution. What it's trying to get at is the slope of the budget constraint. The slope of the budget constraint, I just call it the price ratio because it really is what it is. But I guess we could call it the market rate of substitution because essentially the prices are set by the market. And we're just saying here that if good X, or let's say good Y here, is $9 and good Z is $3, that obviously the market rate of substitution here then would be 1Y for 3Z, right? That if I had only $9 to spend, I could either buy 1Y or I could buy 3Zs. And if we then look at that in terms of the slope here, right, now what I'm doing here, right, is I'm understanding it as the negative ratio of my two products. Negative because it is downward sloping. It implies that trade-off, or one having to be reduced for the other to be increased. Now I can change the income levels. So again, this is still with the budget constraint. I can change the income levels, and what that will do is it will shift my entire budget constraint. If I have more income with no change in prices here, if I have more income with no change in prices, it will shift out the budget constraint. If I have less income, no change in prices, that's where I'll have my inward shift. And that's what I'll see in terms of this parallel shifting of the budget constraint. Now, I could also change the line itself. So again, this is still with the budget constraint. In this case here, if the price of X, well, I should say it this way, price of Y not changing, that the price of good X is falling, then it pivots from the same y-intercept. So the idea here is that for these, for the budget constraint itself, we need to understand 3 points, A, B, and C. Let me write those out here. How do we figure out what point A is? And let's say again this is good Y, and let's say this is good X. Then point A, or the y-intercept, would be equal to the total income divided by the price of good Y. Point B, or the x-intercept, would be the total income divided by the price of good X. C, which is the slope, would be the negative ratio of the negative price ratio of the two products. Okay, so what we're seeing here, the reason why it pivots then is that none of the elements of the y-intercept changed. I didn't change the income, I didn't change the price of good y. Here, the numerator stayed the same, the income levels, but what changed is the price of good x, and in this case the price of good x was falling. Hence, pivoting it outwards. Just making sure here that we see where we're at here. So here's what we've done. In terms of preferences, we talked about their 4 properties. But what those 4 properties, the transitivity, the completeness, the more is better, what that tells us, those 4 properties, is that we can construct what's called the indifference curve. Along this indifference curve, I am indifferent between the bundles. On that line. So any points on this line, I am indifferent between them. Points inside are not preferred. Points outside of that indifference curve are preferred. And there's our completeness assumption, right? I now have the 3 relationships. I could mark this as A, B, and C, and D. All 4 of these bundles now have a relationship to each other. I am indifferent between A and D because they are on the same indifference curve. An indifference curve where the utility levels are constant. I am indifferent between A and D. I prefer C to A. I can see that I prefer it because it's on a point outside of the indifference curve line. A is preferred to B. And we can see that because it's right, it's A is on the indifference curve line, B is inside of it. Now, presumably, there are a series, a finitely large number of indifference curves here. And there is a curve that goes through B, and there's one that goes through C. But the idea is that the utility level attached to each indifference curve line is increasing as I go from left to right. So the utility level that's attached to this might be 100, but the utility level attached to this might be 1000. C is preferred to B because C has a higher level of utility attached to it than B. Now, I guess I should say this as well. Okay, so here's our preferences. Let me just add one more slide to this here before we proceed. Here's our preferences. Again, this is given to us with the indifference curve. The other side of this would be the constraint. And that constraint would be my budget line, the budget line that we have talked about. The budget line which says then for goods X and good Y, right, that I've got a slope here of the negative of the price ratio, and I can change it based on my income levels and price levels. So if we wanted to look at this in a slightly different way, here's the way that I do it when I teach this as the intermediate microeconomics course. Consider this step 1. Step 1 being I plot out what my preferences are between the products. And again, this can be different for different customers, right? For different types of people have different preferences for products. I myself, again, would never, I hate raw tomatoes. So my preferences for raw tomatoes are very, very hatred of raw tomatoes. Okay, well, my indifference curves are going to look different than Mr. Italiano that loves tomatoes, right? We're going to have differences here in terms of our preferences because we're different people. Consider this step 2. Step 2, now this is going to be the same regardless of the person, as long as the income levels are the same. All that we're implying here is that this is my technical ability to buy these two goods given my income levels. Step 3, not to kind of do a little bit of a preview here. Let me pause this here 1 second because I want to see where I'm at here. Okay, so in step 3, we basically put it all together. And essentially what we do is we take our good Y, good X space, and we put on it our, right, in this case here, our step 2, and here my step 1. To get step 3. Step 1 again being my indifference curves. Step 2 being my budget constraints. Step 3 being my point of optimality. Right there. Okay. And that's what we see right here. That the consumer equilibrium here is going to look like my point where the points are affordable and they maximize my happiness. Here's another way to say it. I am looking for the highest, or I'll put it another way, furthest to the right indifference curve that is just tangent by saying it's tangent, we're saying it just touches the curve at one point, that is just tangent to the budget constraint. When we draw this out here, Again, this is good X, good Y. Here's my budget constraint. Look at this indifference curve. In this indifference curve, it touches the curve here, it touches the curve here. Let's call this U1. That would be indifference curve 1. But look at this one, U2. Because U2 touches the curve at just one point. That would be where it's tangent to it. By saying it's tangent, again, we're saying they have the same slope. And it's a higher indifference curve. Why can't it be U3, which is even a higher indifference curve? So that would mean this is more preferred? Well, the reason is because it's not affordable. So what we see at this point where it's just tangent is then that the slope of the budget constraint is equal to the slope of the indifference curve. Or to put it another way, that the slope of the budget constraint, which is the negative of the ratio of the negative of the price ratio, is equal to the marginal rate of substitution here. This is, I shouldn't write this because it's, I'm saying marginal rate of substitution. Here they're saying market rate of substitution. That the slope of the budget constraint is equal to the slope of the indifference curve. We really haven't talked about what that slope is, but it's equal to the marginal utility of the good on the x-axis, or the change in utility as I buy more of it, over the marginal utility of the good on the y-axis. So negative px over py equals negative mux over muy. And you start to see that on this picture here. You see that point of optimality where they're just tangent. The problem here is that C is preferred to B, C is preferred to A. There is a indifference curve line that's going through D. The problem with D is that it's not affordable. Okay, I'm at about the halfway point for this lengthier lecture, so I'm going to stop it here and then start to create part 2.